So up next, we have a panel on DFCs, something that you all have been thinking a lot about over the last 18, 24 months, and definitely the last few months. I'd like to now invite our panel up to the stage. In the meantime, I will mention we have our Exhibitor Bingo. If you guys were here 2 years ago, we played this. If you visit all of the exhibitors and enter codes into the app, there's an Exhibitor Bingo icon. You're going to get registered to win a prize at the end of the conference. We'll announce that at the end of the day on Thursday. So if you go around, collect those codes and enter them, we'll get you in that. Assigned seats, get those under control. All right, so I am happy to introduce our panel moderator for this panel, The Future is Now, Enforcing DFCs, John Dupnik, the Deputy Executive Administrator of Water Science and Conservation at the Texas Water Development Board, and former General Manager at the Barton Springs District, so a face that's familiar to all of us. We're happy to have you here moderating that panel. John, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce your panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.
Okay, are we hot? Can everybody hear us? Yeah, mic's working? Okay, great. All right, good afternoon, everybody that's attending here live. Also, everybody that's attending through the streaming service. And reminder for everybody, we're being recorded, so no pressure. Everything we say is being captured for posterity, so that makes it easy. Anyway, we've got a great panel for you this afternoon on a topic that's of interest to most of you that are in this room. Most of you are familiar with what a desired future condition is, and as the name of the panel implies, the future is now, enforcing DFCs. So what that really means is that this is a question that's on all our minds. This is a very forward-looking statement, metric, planning goal, a desired future condition, but there's a lot of questions and challenges that are really associated with what we're dealing here today. So what we did is we, Oh yeah, sorry, Leah. Do I need to drive this thing? I'll get it. Apologies, folks. All right. Okay, here we go. So we've assembled our esteemed panel here today, representing really the key perspectives on this question. So we've got our legal perspective, Ms. Fancher here, technical perspective, James Beach, and our the folks on the ground that have to do this every day, our groundwater managers and our groundwater district perspective. So I've asked the panelists to think ahead of time about some of the key challenges, some of the key problems associated with this question of managing to a desired future condition. And I've also asked them to kind of put their thinking caps on and come up with some solutions for how to address those challenges. So what are the practical solutions? And the favorite question on the table is, if they were the benevolent despot, if they were the dictator, all the power in the world, no limits, what would be the solution? So it should be interesting to hear some of those responses. So we've got a great panel, all these different perspectives. Without further ado, let me jump right into our introductions here. So to my immediate right, Kristen Fancher. Kristen is an attorney and the owner and founder of Fancher Legal, PLLC. She has extensive experience in representing clients on water and other legal matters across the state. She represents a diverse array of clients, from water districts to landowners to private companies, and has brings a very broad perspective of experience to the panel. So again, Kristen will be providing that legal perspective on the panel this afternoon. And then to my further right, Mr. James Beach. James is a licensed professional geoscientist. He's also the principal at Advanced Groundwater Solutions, LLC. Has 30 years of experience in quantitative groundwater hydrology. James provides consulting services for districts, water suppliers, landowners, and many other entities, including services supporting the regional water planning efforts. So James is our technical brain, our scientific brain on the panel, and he'll bring that point of view to the discussion. And then finally, on the end, Mr. Dirk Aaron. Many of you in the groundwater community are familiar with Dirk. He's been a fixture among the groundwater district's discussions and of the community for many years. He, of course, is the general manager of Clearwater Underground Water Conservation District and has been since 2011. He's also been very active in TAG by serving as president and vice president, and then also active on the planning scene by representing Clearwater on GMA 8 and also with Brazos G Regional Water Planning Group. So just take a quick moment to recognize our panel and thank them for being here this afternoon. This is not an easy question to dig into. There's lots of challenges and sticky wickets to manage. But before we jump into the discussion, most of you in this room, if you've got a wonky water brain like we do, are familiar with what a desired future condition is. But if not, I wanted to set the stage, provided just a little bit of context to give you the basic primer on what we're talking about this afternoon. So I've got a graphic here that was the simplest way I know of to really describe the regional planning process, what a desired future condition is, and why it matters. The map on the right represents, this is of course the state of Texas, but also represents the 16 groundwater management areas. Within these groundwater management areas that are aligned effectively to represent the major aquifer systems are the individual districts that on a 5-year recurring basis are tasked with coming together and determining collectively what their common goal is from a management perspective for their common shared aquifers. And so the ultimate outcome of this process is the desired future condition. So a desired future condition is a quantifiable, measurable condition of the aquifer. It usually represents some sort of physical metric, namely maximum drawdown, minimum spring flow preservation, saturated thickness, those sorts of things. But it's a physical condition that defines what the common goal is going to be for the districts that share that DFC within these GMAs. So let's move over to the left side of the screen, and this is the process in a nutshell. And I'm going to get up and advance the slide a couple of times here just to walk through it. So the way it works is the groundwater districts are the assigned voting members with the GMAs, and they take the advice and the input of stakeholders, advisory committees. They go through a suite of factors defined by statute, including consideration of hydrogeological conditions, property rights, socioeconomic conditions. We call them the 9 factors affectionately. Then they also have to consider this balancing test. When considering a desired future condition, they have to think about what's the maximum amount of practicable groundwater production that can be allowed while balancing that also with the conservation of the resource. So pretty tough decision making that gets involved with this process, considering the factors, and there's also this balancing test. Ultimately, the product is the desired future condition that's represented in the box outlined in red there. And then once that policy statement is determined, it's handed over to our agency, the Texas Water Development Board. We apply the best available science, namely through the groundwater availability models, the GAMs, and then the product of that is an estimate of pumping. What's the volume of pumping on an annual basis that can be afforded to preserve that desired future condition? And we like to call that modeled available groundwater, or MAG. So the purpose of that number really serves 2 key distinct purposes that we're going to get into here in the discussion. On the left side, that number basically determines the water budget that regional water planning groups have to do their planning. How much groundwater is available from that particular aquifer to inform what sort of their planning and their water management strategies. That gets rolled up into the state water plan. We do that on a 5-year basis. And then on the right side of the screen, it's also the modeled available groundwater and desired future conditions also are very important in informing how districts managed. The districts are required by statute to incorporate how they are going to achieve their desired future conditions into their management plan. The rules are also required to support those same efforts. And then ultimately the MAGs are to be considered in their permitting decisions. This happens on a 5-year loop as well. All the while, the districts are required to monitor their desired future conditions. So there's a groundwater planning component, groundwater management component. I've done enough talking. The stage is set. Now let's hand it over to our panel so we can dig into this. And so we'll start with the overarching question to really set the stage, and we'll move through the panelists to have them address their individual perspectives. So Kristen, we'll start with you. So from your legal perspective as an attorney, and as you represent your clients, what would you say are the primary challenges or problems associated with managing to or enforcing a DFC?
I think on the very fundamental issue that districts face is the regulatory uncertainty. That this is somewhat of an untested process from the sense of we don't have a lot of precedent in terms of between GMA petitions and then obviously no court cases. So when you have what's a relatively new statute, as we know over the last several sessions, not this past session because nothing was done in water, but the ones prior to that, we had a lot of changes to 36. We have changes to the DFC process. And so the point is that there's a lot of unknowns. We're in a period now where we're creating the law, like with oil and gas 100 years ago. They were in a period then of creating the law. Now we're creating the law, and so that means that there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty for districts.
So James, same question for you. I mean, the overarching question is, what are the general challenges, primary problems? And so we have regulatory uncertainty, the law's not clear, there's a lot of ambiguity there. From a technical perspective, what sort of challenges do you see as a technical consultant when you're trying to advise your district clients and your GMA clients?
Yeah, it's amazing how different everything is across the state, right? There's just districts that are very well established. They've established protocols, rules, management plan. They've been there a long time. Different districts, and then there's other districts that are new to the whole process. There's different levels of funding. I'm preaching to the choir here if you're familiar with GCDs and are on the board or a general manager. But all of that sets up a lot of different drivers for how you approach this process. The one key thing, and I think the talk before us was very critical, is data and making sure that you're defining your methodologies well to gather data so that you can continue to address your status of your DFC. And, obviously there's a lot of difference between West Texas and East Texas, confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers. And, the whole perspective of local management that we see in Chapter 36 with the overlay of DFCs and GMAs is still, as Kristen noted, there's still a lot of ambiguity there. There's still a lot of untested waters there. So we'll get some answers maybe from the courts or petitions at some point. But I think the challenge really is making sure that you're collecting the right data. If you've got a DFC statement and you're a GCD manager or on the board of a GCD, you should probably look at that DFC statement and go, are we collecting the right data? And be able to speak to the status of that DFC with the data you have. And I think one thing that is interesting, regardless of where you're at, a lot of people see the DFC process and joint planning as being very critical for areas where there's exports going on or there's a high volume of water. I always go back to the definition in some of the fundamental, hydrogeology textbooks about the definition of an aquifer. And it's always really fuzzy because it doesn't matter whether your wells make a gallon a minute or 10,000 gallons a minute. They can both be defined as an aquifer, and it depends on the importance of that and the fight that can bring on speaks to the value of water. And so it doesn't matter where you're at or how much water's there. It's probably just a matter of time before DFCs become important for you. So making sure that you get the right information, have the plan, and I think that the overarching question, I see legal minds and technical minds speaking on both ends of this spectrum with regard to whether this is planning or whether this is a regulatory driver and a regulatory kind of a issue. And so I think there needs to be a lot more clarity there. And I think that sets up how you go about getting data, establishing data, speaking to where you're at with your DFC. So I think that's important and a big challenge too.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that there's regulatory uncertainty, there's ambiguity in the law, there's fuzzy definitions, what is an aquifer? Data, I think we all agree, is kind of the key here. But I think you're also right on point, James. It's not real clear because of the regulatory uncertainty and the ambiguity in the law. Is it a planning process? Is it a regulatory process? Is it both? What's the driver? So Dirk, as a groundwater district manager, the rubber hits the road for you all. As a district, do you have to sort of wade through this fog? You have to determine how do you interpret some of these things that aren't quite clear? And as James put it, the underlying thing that you can do is collect the data, but not all districts are created equal. And I had a board member that once said that science is expensive, and it is. So how do you manage all that? How do you tackle the investments and what's needed to be able to answer these questions and also navigate this sort of smoke-laden range?
That's right. Well, the first thing I want to say is that several of my board members are here, so my opinion today may not be the majority opinion of my bosses. We all know that we work for elected officials or appointed. But with that caveat, I will speak to the guiding principles of our board have been exactly what Ms. Jackson's quote up there was. If you don't have the data, you can't get the science. If you can't get the science, you can't have solid, a defendable policy. There's a way to look at what she was said positively and then say, if we don't, then we can't. And so districts that are underfunded, whether they're a single county district or a multi-county district, you're going to have a challenge simply to get the data. And then secondly is, in the development of your budgets and your commitments, find ways that you can afford with your limited resources. But to get to that point, you have to have a board that's committed to developing data, and then in the real primary challenge is to have an analytical process. The so what? I know of districts that have been in place a long time, a lot of data. But what's the so what of that data within a radius of influence of a group of wells or radius of influence within an entire district? What's going on there? And that's where the future is here now. And the challenge, in my opinion, is for districts to continue to invest in science, understand what John said, that we're not all created equal. And we'll talk about some of those opportunities to create some incentivize and bring equality in terms of a shared resource, share the strength of one, and know the synergistic nature of a weak district in terms of funding. What can we do to assist? And then understand that once you look at the data, you have to have an open mind. You have to have a desire to know the so what, and then be prepared if the so what is not what you want to hear or see. And then how does that drive the policy decisions? After 30 years in agri-life extension and in the research community and applied research, sometimes we put money toward research projects with an end desire and a knowledge of what we want that to be. But in the groundwater world, we have to have a commitment as a board and as staff to know that the results of a good scientific endeavor might tell you something that puts you on a path that is uncomfortable and that may not be what your board or your community wants to hear.
So just a quick follow-up, Dirk, and we've got a little bit of extra time to be able to navigate within this overarching question. But we see on the map here that not the entire state is not covered in a color. There are these so-called white spaces. So we've heard that a challenge from a district perspective is committing to collecting the data, working within the limited resources. How do you adjust to factors that are beyond your control?
Well, in what you're referring to, I'm thinking, but I've said this publicly for a long time, the elephant in the room for Clearwater and the I-35 corridor is the unmanaged areas that have a huge dependency on groundwater whether they want to admit it or not. And that, in our case, is the boundaries to the south. And so the question our board is asking, can we meet our DFC? Is the DFC being busted? Can we find policy decisions that'll be effective? Or the answer might be, no, you can't, because you can't control the untethered use of groundwater. But then again, our board has said, well, let's look at it holistically. No, we didn't get the funding for the board to look at it, but let's look at it ourselves. Let's develop the scientific discernment. And we're finding it isn't about the overproduction as much as it is the structure and the hydraulics of the aquifer in those areas where we have this shared decline. So again, the science is giving clarity, and then it might also show why people are suffering on both sides of the county line, that it may not be necessarily because they don't have a groundwater district. It might just be necessarily the aquifer itself can only do so much in that given area.
Yeah, and of course you can only tell that story if you have the data and you can collect the information to be able to see what's really going on.
That's right.
Yeah. So we've got a little bit of wiggle room within this overarching question. James, Kristen, anything to add to some of those challenges now that you've heard some of the other perspectives here?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to say that that James and Dirk, kind of gave me a great idea about is that essentially what we do know. I mentioned regulatory uncertainty, but the one thing we do know in Chapter 36 is that data and best available science and data, and those terms are used frequently. So, like I said, there's so much that we don't know. So my a lot of times advice to clients is, what we do know is that you can't have too much data. In your production reporting, for example, that is key. We often think about monitor wells, and I know James has a lot to say about that, but monitor wells obviously are a wonderful benchmark to determine how are we on track to meet the DFC, but also taking a really, really hard look at how you're collecting your production reporting data, how you're analyzing it. Are you checking to see whether or not the data is accurate? For example, if a public water supplier sends their numbers in and they're off, or they're off from the previous reporting period, what is the check and balance there to try to get that corrected? And I know a lot of districts are doing databases that are incorporating that, but I think it's thinking beyond just monitor wells. It's looking at the sufficiency of your data. And again, from my perspective, like I tell clients, you can't have too much. And you also, you would like to see the peer review process. That's another part of it. In 360015, it specifically says that's publicly available for peer review, essentially. So those are the things that, like I said, while we don't have a lot, we don't know a lot, what we do know is data, as y'all hear.
Yeah, and just to set up the challenge, well, from a technical perspective, James, one additional level, and we'll drift over into solutions and what could be done to address some of these things. But is it very clear in your mind where that line is in terms of compliance and how you measure when a DFC has been exceeded versus when it's been met? And what, from a technical perspective, what sort of challenges are associated with some of those questions that are still unanswered?
Well, obviously when you get two experts in the room or two lawyers, you're always going to have a debate and you're always going to have a big argument about that. So I don't know that we ever get to the end of that with a good silver bullet answer. But obviously, as we've been talking about, making sure that you've got enough information and that you've got a standardized, defensible methodology to analyze your data, whether it's water levels, spring flow, whatever the case might be, and that you've kind of, on your own, hopefully tested that before somebody comes in the door to test you on it. And so I think one of the things that is always happening with information and data collection is that you're kind of adapting your management and your data collection and your methods all the time and improving those all the time. We all know that there's more information you can get. You can probably, some districts can maybe do away with some of the data they're collecting to focus on other areas if the objectives are there to do that, or if the challenges are there, or if they've learned that a particular piece of data, whether it be water levels or whatever, is costing too much to help them get to where they want to go. And so I think, the defensibility is critical, and to establish those methods for collecting data, methods for analyzing it, making sure you're testing it and improving it all the time are pretty critical. And I think one thing that sometimes we forget is prematurely defining DFCs that we can't measure, that we don't have data for, can be not necessarily helpful. And it's always an interesting topic to deal with non-relevant aquifers within the joint planning process, and understand that in some cases, GCDs still have the ability to manage non-relevant aquifers if before they get the data to have a DFC or to monitor and to enforce a DFC. And so I think that's a critical element at sometimes, and so we have to just kind of weigh all of those issues as you're looking down the road at what's important to withstand a challenge to your DFCs, or to enter into a debate technically about whether you're going to meet your DFC or not.
And if I just kind of maybe tie a bow around that for us, is the real challenge is for the GMs as well as their elected board officials to surround themselves with either staff members or consulting community and a legal team that helps balance and find some synergism there that gives you guidance. And then for me, it's to be prone to suggestion from those teams that we invest in. And then though, make the hard questions and the hard calls that might say, we need to refine our relationship. It's getting too expensive over here. We're not getting anywhere with it. And then come to conferences like this and have conversations and go to the booths and see what the newest technology is, and then determine what do we have and what do we not have and what do we need to do to get to that point is an important part of the maturing process for a GCD.
And so just to kind of wrap up the framing up the challenge, framing up the problem, how do you enforce a DFC? How do you manage toward a DFC? I think I might add one additional layer, in that there's a lot of detail in statute that lays out how the process is intended to work. But once you start to get into the petition side of things, much of it has not been tested. And I think every time we have sort of that case study that tests the process, we end up running back to the legislature to say we found a problem, or this didn't work quite the way we thought it would. So would you all agree that that is one of the challenges as well? And Kristen, I'll look to you as the attorney in the room. Does that present certain challenges?
It does, from a sense of it becomes a moving target, I think. And I'm thinking overarching, not necessarily just in the DFC petition process, but overarching, I think the challenges for GCDs over the last 10 to 15 years has been the moving target of, okay, we're established, we feel good about our program, and then now we kind of insert a new aspect to it. And so I think that certainly is the case. I do think, in the context of the DFC petition, when there are questions where you go, hey, there's sort of a stop, there's essentially the language in the statute stops, and we need more answers to it. I think that can be good, especially whenever it's designed to be procedural in nature. I'm all for procedural. Let's procedurally fix some things where they need to be fixed. But, adding more for you guys, for the managers to do is not what I'm in favor of.
Okay, so I think we framed up the challenges very well. I mean, these are very nebulous things with a lot of unanswered questions. There's regulatory uncertainty, ambiguity in the law. Where you have a dearth of data can really create a challenge. So obviously more data is better. So we framed up the challenges. So we're going to move on into the next segment of the panel here, which is the segment where I've asked the panelists to be the benevolent despot, the king or queen for the day, all powerful, no limits in terms of authority or funding. And this is always a fun one, for me anyway. But I've asked them to sort of think about money, no limit. You could change the law with the stroke of the pen. What, in your individual views, are some of the bold measures that are needed to address some of these challenges? And so, James, we're going to start with you. From a technical perspective, sky's the limit, no boundaries. What needs to be done to address some of these issues?
Well, Dirk started with a disclaimer earlier, so I'm going to do that now. consultant, I have to be very careful about what I say because I represent lots of folks, and whatever I say may come back to haunt me. So what I will say is this: to start with this principle. Number one, there is no silver bullet answer. A king or a queen can't make all great decisions that are going to solve the problems. The issue is you've got a very valuable resource in water. It doesn't matter if it's a 1 gallon a minute well or 100,000, or a 10,000 gallon a minute well. It's a valuable resource, and that's what makes decisions hard. And so that's the principle we start with. Number two, I think the one thing that we could gain from and get better direction from, if there's clarity on whether this is a planning process or a regulatory process, and I think that will sort itself out with time, one way or the other, whether it's through the legislature or court decisions or petitions or whatever the case might be. But I think that's the one thing that really drives, how you see the process, whether it's planning and you're feeding numbers into the regional water planning groups, and that's the way you see it, and then you use Chapter 36 and all the other tools in that toolbox to regulate, or whether you see it as a regulatory function and process, and you're going to design a DFC and hold everybody accountable that way. I think the nature of how you see that process and the lack of clarity there drives a lot of what we're seeing with regard to the challenges. And so I'm not very good at being a dictator or king or queen, so I'll just say I think those are some areas we could improve upon and help districts and the regulated community both have better clarity moving forward and have less risk on both ends.
So and before we go to the other panelists, I just want to add on just a follow-up question for you. So, and this has come up several times, where there's, in the view of some, there's not real clear whether the DFC serves a regulatory function or a planning function. If you trust my little cartoon here, it does both.
Yes.
It serves as a groundwater availability number for planning, and it also drives management objectives and things from an actual district management perspective. Do you feel like that's not clear and it needs more clarity?
So I go back to, for those of you who've been around these conferences and water conferences for a long time, I go back to who owns groundwater debate that we listened to for 10 or 15 years, and then the Day case came along and we go, we're gonna get our answer. And the Day case said, well, you own it, but it can be regulated. And so we're still debating all of that. And I think this is a very similar issue where it's hard to, I agree with you. I see both of those functions in Chapter 36. And so obviously I don't have all the answers, but I think that more clarity on that issue is going to be critical as we move forward. And where that comes from, I guess we'll figure that out as we go. But
all right. Okay, Dirk.
Yep.
So we'll move on to you from the perspective of a groundwater manager. You're doing the job. You're actually on the ground having to deal with these challenges. What if you could maybe wave your magic wand? What sort of bold measures do you see are necessary to be able to address some of these challenges? You mentioned limited funding, some of the regulatory questions, lack of control in certain areas of the state. What do you believe some of those bold measures are to address some of those things?
Well, there was a concept that I had proposed to the three of you, and I think tempering that to think more about what's attainable if it could be brought to light. And I think of people in the room, leaders that have been in place since we saw, those of you that didn't see the picture of Robbie Cook and in relative to CE's going away, Robbie was key to the DFC process. He championed that as a representative, correct? And so we're here today in maturing through that process. So in my mind, after also serving on Region G, state water planning, we now have state flood planning, I can see a funding by the state that helps make everything equal. There's districts that cannot contribute to the update of a GAM in our GMA, but districts who have rolled up their sleeves and really invested. Now that update to the North Texas GAM is now 10 years old. We blinked our eye and it's 10 years old. Those districts made the initial investment, now have a lot of production data, there's site-specific data. Our district's committed to pumping tests that can be added to it. So getting some state funding that formalizes that would be really cool to me. Also, because we have the board, and you saw the presentation before ours, they are equipped with technology. Now's the time, I would think, that if we could have a discussion across GMAs, across the state, about analytical tools. Now that we've seen all this data out there, can we develop analytical tools that can be segued into helping us make sound, legally defensible policy? Those analytical tools are only being talked about on the fringes right now, and you're going to hear Michelle Sutherland's going to talk about some of that. I know Amy Bush is, and I know Michaela Pedrosa is going to give a presentation of our first reiteration of an analytical tool. Not first, it's like the fifth. James came up with the first version of that and worked us through a process. So if I was that person for a day, I would say, can we come to conclusions and then be able to collectively talk about the results of those things? Put more in our toolbox.
Right.
With money. Money, money, money.
Yeah, money seems to be the theme here. Lack of it or the need for it. So Kristen, from a legal perspective, you've got your magic wand. You could change the laws. What sort of things, in your view, from an attorney's perspective, are really needed to address some of this regulatory uncertainty or some of the ambiguity in the law?
Mine, it dovetails off of what Dirk said, that I think that if we treated the DFC planning process like the regional water planning process, and when you really look and you look in the statutes at both different planning processes, the intent is very similar. So if my bold measure, for example, would be, like Dirk said, have the funding. So the way that the regional water planning groups are funded, have a similar mechanism for the DFC, for the GMAs, and then we also would have a more robust, I guess, guidance document, and that's something I know I had mentioned where maybe Water Development Board comes into play. I know, James, you do a lot of the regional water planning, the plans for the different groups, and y'all have an outline exactly. You have to check the box and meet all the different criteria. Maybe if we had more of that, I know that that's something that I would like to see. Funding, but then also that a more formalized process where we're not going, well, I hope we did this right. We use 36108 as our checklist, but it would answer some of the questions that lie within that provision.
All right, so before we move on to the reality check, any final comments? Now that you've heard some of the responses from the other panelists, anything you might add? Did you get an inspiration in terms of what's the big solution? It doesn't even need to be politically realistic or there's no funding limitation here, but anything to add on in terms of the solutions to provide more direction here or address some of these issues?
Well, in the GMA process, and I'll use GMA 8, getting those unmanaged counties a seat at the table, incentivize their participation opposed to demonizing it, I believe would resolve a lot, because then they become more informed. If their county commissioners court is to have a representative of some kind in different, just as the GCDs do, that actually, that's a shift in, that's a paradigm shift in the mindset of GCDs and our elected boards. I believe my board would be more, they're all about inclusiveness. And so incentivizing those counties that don't have a GCD, Northern Travis, Williamson County, we've got 20% growth, and we thought we'd have about 17 over the last 10 years. Our two judges are communicating along the county line. They're anticipating 57,000 new homes in the very near future in southern Bell County. That is in a rural area, and it's inevitable. It's been bought up. The developers are looking at it. So why not bring, in a robust funded plan like this, bring those people together, and then maybe through some sort of an understanding, by incentivizing it, they might see the need for managing, not just for today, but for tomorrow.
All right, before you all get dethroned, any final comments?
One thing I'll say, Dirk, is that you brought to mind, I think that, I know we've said for years, that, hey, the decisions are being made for you. For the unregulated areas, the decisions are being made for you. I know Ty Embry is the one that says that the best, so I'll give him the credit for that statement. But so those decisions are being made for you, and so I think that having maybe that education with some of those counties, and I know, with GMA8, for example, a lot of those areas districts, they were unregulated, and then after the PGMA was established. So a question I have is, okay, so is this going to be where we've got these unregulated areas and some of the data that we're collecting, the rest of us that, the DFCs are being enforced on, is that going to then contribute to the PGMA creation process? And I think we'd like to see that, and that's kind of a question back to you, I guess both of you.
Well, I'll answer that because it's one of my final talking points is there's a lot of things I'd like to see. One, I would like to see legislatively TCEQ empowered to do that in a proper way and it not be so politicized. And you obviously, there's legislative staff members here, they're like, Dirk, that's pie in the sky. Well, that's what we're talking about. If we're king for the day, and again, without doing it, muscling people in, but incentivizing them to have a seat at the table and with an understanding of what's there, and tie some of this back to the state water plan, because that's where Williamson County needs money for infrastructure. The SWIFT funds, Carlos championed that. And so having those those three-way connections there would allow them to, because it's really easy. If we were deviant, we could, as a GMA, we can set the DFC so that the MAG is run this, and too bad, so sad, you can't get any SWIFT funds because you busted your DFC. Well, they don't even know what their MAG. They don't even know what a MAG is, but they are evolving. I will say the regional planning process has helped evolve that group. Now connect the two.
Yeah, and just to finish up, and back to what Dirk was talking about earlier, the data develops the science and the science develops the policy, which is going to lead to good decisions in planning. And so I think if we don't have the good data and funding for that, to get that data, then we're missing the very first step. And that uncertainty on the policy and, planning regulation aspects of this process leads to, uncertainty for everybody on both sides of the table, both the districts and the regulated community and all of those folks that are out there developing the whole corridor between Dallas and San Antonio. So I think better data, better science leads to less risk for everyone in that process.
Yeah, I think Director Jackson would be so proud that we've invoked that mantra quite often because it just it's so true on a lot of levels. It seems like science and data are the key here. That seems to be a theme.
Science, data, and people.
And the people.
Right people.
Right. So we're shifting gears. So the final question. So when we constructed the format of this panel, we were kind of thinking about, well, there's lots of questions involved in this process. There's a lot of untested aspects of it. There's a lot of challenges associated with managing towards a desired future condition, enforcing one. Let's lay out the challenges. Let's talk about what are those bold solutions, realistic or not, that might be needed to address some of them. But we wanted to finish maybe with some nuggets that are more practical, some takeaways that you all as an audience could start thinking about, maybe some seeds of inspiration, some more practical measures that we could leave you all with to think about to address some of these challenges. So I'm going to start off with Dirk. You get the first crack at this one. So really from a more practical perspective, we've laid out the challenges, we've talked about the really bold measures, we've kind of drifted into some of the more practical stuff, collecting data, seat at the table for planning purposes. But if you were to concisely sort of wrap up what you believe could be done from a practical perspective and from the district of the perspective of a groundwater district and groundwater manager, what would that be?
So I'll throw out some trigger words. First one is prop. Second one is fund. Third one is empower. The third one would be the word merge, annexation, or a hybrid of such. And with that, a bold move, the reality would be the prop would be to prop up the GMA process with funding from the state. No doubt. Director Jackson, that statement right there just wraps it up. And if we walk out of here forgetting anything, I would pray that you didn't forget that. The funding is necessary so that districts can be created equal within their GMA. It's not about competing GMAs, but it's the shared needs within a GMA for money. Empower, and I talk about empowering the board with funding to assist us on these analytical tools. Case in point is the subsidence tool that's there for us. It's there, it's an analytical tool. It adds to our management plan as we develop it every 5 years. The other is the things that we don't want to hear is mandatory merging or the optics of a shared desire for merging or annex some areas. It's hard for a board to open up their heart and mind to that because I helped create a district in the 80s in Terry County. It was about getting our own district so nobody else come in, so we didn't have to listen to anybody else. That was kind of the mantra back then, and that's not true today. Annexation, when we are brought to, people ask through the petitioning process within Chapter 36, keep an open mind. Don't judge and don't make a public statement that you will or won't. Listen to their needs and then then go through a process with those people petitioning for annexation. And what's the options for them if we don't annex? But can we help them get to the next step? And the other is a hybrid of those. I think of Drew Satterwhite. I thank the good Lord every day that I don't have to wear 3 complex hats, but it's in his genetics. You know, we saw his dad up there today, Cremois, and nobody realized that the battle CE had with Cremois, and he's getting a plaque at TWCA from Drew's father. That's where I think that the reality is we have people who are capable of solving problems, and we have board members who have a desire to have a better understanding of what's going on. We can actually have a reality check when we look at those assets that we have out there.
Okay, Dirk, I forgot to say you don't have the crown anymore. We had to put the magic wand down. So merging and annexation, those are pretty bold suggestions.
They are not the opinions of my board.
Right, okay. All right.
But they are part of the conversation.
Right. All right, thank you, Dirk. So, Kristen, from an attorney's perspective, how would you, given the practical reality of our current circumstances and, limited resources, ambiguity in the law, there's white spaces that aren't managed out there, how would you advise your clients in terms of addressing some of these challenges?
What I say is, let's do, like I mentioned earlier, what we do know. And what we know is that in Section 36108, we use that as a checklist. And for every factor or element that we're required to address in that process, what is your proof? So, from a legal perspective, okay, that's great, but I want to know what is the proof of that we've considered this factor. So for each and every thing, and what should eventually be incorporated into the explanatory report, what is the proof behind that? Because as we know, we've got 2 benchmarks essentially that in the law, highest practicable level of production, and then conservation recharge and some of those. If your pendulum is swung really far over to one of those sides, you better have the abundance of proof to show why. And so that's the main thing I think from a practical perspective, is just thinking of it like that, as every single element I must meet. What is my proof that I've met it, and is it good enough? And then also, just really quick, I think that if you've got another practical perspective, I think is, so for example, if you're trying to add to your monitor well network, thinking of it like maybe when we're doing these permits, maybe we can ask these permittees to put a special condition in there that, we're gonna test that well, or we're gonna monitor that well annually. In many districts, they find that the permittee agrees to that. So that seems to me like an easy way. You're already having to go through the permitting process. You're issuing a permit, and let's see if some of these permittees will agree to this condition so you can add to your network, and some of those kind of what are easier things that we can do, and really with boots on the ground approach as we're in there permitting, in there having conversations with applicants.
So leverage the process perhaps to expand the network,
Yes.
collect more data, actually get on-site information to be able to make a permitting decision once they go into production.
Right.
That seems like a good practical solution. So James, you get the final word on the practical advice here. From a technical perspective, you advise lots of districts. I know you've worked through various GMAs on one, developing effective DFCs, but also districts in terms of how they manage to or defend a DFC or demonstrate compliance. What's that practical level of advice? How would you advise your clients on how to address some of these issues?
Yeah, so back to what Kristen was talking about just then, I think it's really important that you as a district and among the districts in a GMA all understand, first of all, in your own house, in your own GCD, how do we strike this balance? Can you articulate that? Can you help whoever's writing your explanatory report, can you help them explain how you came to that balance of striking maximum practical use versus conservation? And just having that practical conversation at home and then at the GMA, and understanding how other folks are doing that, and if you're in an aquifer or in a setting where others' opinions and approaches and methods are going to be affecting you, then make sure you understand how that may play out. And so, obviously, to reiterate what we've been talking about already, you should be, asking yourself on a regular basis, how are we measuring? How are we evaluating? How are we adapting, both locally, and if our DFC is regional in nature, like some are, then how are we talking to other districts to see how we're doing to enforce that, or how are we measuring it and analyzing it, and what would we say if somebody came in the door and challenged us on it, and have those conversations. Obviously, you need to have them in public at GMA meetings and make those discussions more easily available to others so that they understand where you're at. And then I think sometimes in the DFC process we're always talking about model runs and how that plays out and the imperfect nature of modeling and all of that, and we get focused on that. But really, sometimes we forget it's the data that is going to be used to enforce those DFCs. And so, as you're looking at that modeled result and what you set as a DFC, how does that really compare to your pumping data and your real results in your monitoring and your evaluation? Are you totally missing the kind of the meshing of those, or are they actually on track? Or are they actually helpful in what you're trying to achieve? So I think those are the practical things that you can do on a day-to-day basis, and continue to challenge yourself internally, because the challenge from externally might be there before you know it.
Yeah, so my quick takeaway is here, a crown really doesn't help. There is no silver bullet, and you're never done. That's right. It seems like from what you described, James, is that you constantly have to collect the data, you input the data into the model, then you have to constantly compare the outputs of the model to what you're actually seeing on the ground, collect more data, and it's an iterative process. And then we're going to kind of wrap up this question, and I'm going to shamelessly quote Director Jackson again: the better the data, the better the science, the better the science, the better the policy. So we've got some extra time here. We're actually ahead of schedule.
I've got questions for you too.
Okay. But before we get to questions, any closing remarks before we move on to question and answer? That your director, that's a wonderful positive statement, but I go back to, if you're asking yourself as a district as you're walking out the door, do we have quality data? Do we have some sort of QC? Because if we don't have the data, quality data, methodical, intentional, then we will not have the science. Then by not having the science, the district is failing its constituents. That's really the root of what she's saying to us. She's just so diplomatic. If she was speaking to us here today, she wouldn't be as blunt as I just was, that I am. But I admire that, and I will tell you this: the last thing I want people to think of, walk out of here, I want them to walk out of here understanding that we have a shared job and the board is our resource. Work with the board
encourage the things that we heard from Tinnerus today, and they plug those into our toolbox, utilize what's there for us. And I think we'll continue to move forward.
All right, I think we have, Leah, do
She
we
left.
have time for Q&A? All right.
We'll find out who we made mad.
I've got questions coming in on all mediums, but first maybe we'll see if there's anyone who wants to raise a hand and voice any questions from the audience before I start the ones that came in. All right. So trying to kind of take these in slightly thematic order. So is there a standard way for checking compliance status of a DFC for all GCDs, or is that just something that kind of happens here, there, everywhere, or maybe not at all?
I'll start if that works.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question, and the answer is no. There's not a standard way. That's part of the regulatory uncertainty. One thing that I think that brings up for me is, so the question of whether it's regulatory or planning. Well, it is both, and in 36, it's both, Chapter 36, because in 36.3011, it's, every district could be subject to the TCQ petition process, and what it basically says is, are your rules designed to meet or to help you achieve that DFC? So the issue for me is I go, okay, so today, there is something that today I could be petitioned on. But yet in other areas of Chapter 36, it's a long-term, it's a 50-year look. So in other words, okay, well, I guess the answer, or one of the things I tell clients is, okay, what we need to do is we need to make sure your rules show what your plan is, not that you're necessarily meeting it today, but what your plan is, and your rules and your management plan, and how those are. So we need to add provisions after that round of legislative changes. We add provisions to make sure that we're making clear this is how we intend to achieve our DFC, even if that's not today.
Yeah, totally agree. There is no specified way to do it. That's the only right way. And obviously that speaks to Chapter 36 is, I guess, local management, overriding local management approach, right? Even though we're working within GMAs and we're doing regional planning and joint planning, there's still, a heavy emphasis on local management. And so if you've got local management, then you've got local DFCs, you've got local data, you've got local processes to look at that and to, set rules and management plan and everything else. And so there's a complex overlay there, but I think, because of the complexity and even the difference that you see in DFC statements and whether they're local or regional and how they're applied, and I think all of that requires that there be, various ways to do this. And that's why I think, stand by what I said earlier. I think what everybody's agreeing to is, you need to be challenging yourself to make sure that, whatever you're doing and your methods and your results, when somebody asks you the question, where do you stand on your DFCs, that you've got a good solid answer. So it doesn't have to be the same methodology across the state.
And if I might add to that answer, though, is if you are collecting data and you're putting it on the shelf and you can't answer what's the trends toward achieving our DFC, then you're actually missing the mark. And it's pretty, it's a situation where your board cannot defend what they're doing if you're not actually looking at the reality of it.
And kind of following up on that, there was another question asking whether or not there should be a requirement and more scrutiny for DFC monitoring and compliance, such as every 5 years in an explanatory report.
You'll go ahead. All right, I'll start us again. Whether there should be, I think that would be a challenge because, like we talked about, there are budget limitations for districts that are not able to implement maybe that frequently. So because of, the essentially unfunded mandate where this is all locally funded, I think it's problematic because there's going to be some that just can't do it at the same timeline as some other districts. And then what you're doing is you're basically creating potentially either a system that's too hard to achieve for a lot of districts, or the bar is so low that then you have, and John and I have talked about this, then you have the bar so low that essentially you have those meeting the minimum criteria and not doing what they would do otherwise because the statute has less strict requirements than they were planning on doing.
And if we prop up the GMA process with some funding and support from the state, I think that'll fill the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah, so this speaks to your point, Dirk. All districts not created equal.
Correct.
Different levels of sophistication, different accessibility to resources, and with a little bit of support from some source, a rising tide would raise all boats, sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Right.
So another question that came in kind of in the same vein, assuming you have the good data, and that's telling us that we're at or over a DFC, what should a GCD, or what can or will a GCD do for current and future permittees? And what role, if any, would restrictions on exempt wells play in that?
District manager, maybe?
Well, I'll try that, and I'll reference back to what Kristen said earlier. It's not been tested. But in our place, if you have a good scientific team and you have a good legal team and you're not burdened by what you don't want to hear, and prepare yourself for some sort of proportional adjustment and based on sound, defendable data. And the data, though, you better QC it. I'll talk about Alan Day. Alan I've known for 30, 40 years. He encouraged me to think about different metrics within our water level measurement because we use a hybrid of that. Make absolutely sure you put your employee in a position that they have to check, double check, double check. And the pleasure for me was that process we put in place. An intern this summer, in his presentation to the board, said, I didn't realize how important that was. And I will say that Alan Day and James both said to me, if your data isn't any good, all that investment, you're going to pitch it in a can, and you're going to start all over.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, Dirk, and there's sort of a theme here, is that if you've got the data, if you don't have the data, invest in the data, or collect what you can, develop a plan so that you clearly define how you intend to measure your DFC or aquifer levels relative to the DFC, and then make sure that it's very clearly communicated. I think transparency is also obviously a fundamental in governance, but it's key to be able to communicate how you intend to do this, because there is not a one-size-fits-all method to demonstrating compliance with the DFC, or how you use it to inform a permitting decision.
And in our case, 50% of the groundwater use comes from our exempt well owners, over 5,000. Opposed to 140 permitted wells that are 50% of the rest of the production. We intentionally do a really hard look at our exempt well users to determine what are their groundwater demands right now, and not just plug in 25,000 gallons a day and calculate it all out. And because the reality is, even in certain areas of our district, we know groundwater use by exempt well owners is much higher than others. And so we try to have a very, very scientific look, mathematical approach to how we determine that. So because the law is specific, we cannot curtail those exempt well owners, and I don't think the guiding principle of any groundwater district is to ever harm that relationship. I would hope that we're all on the same page there.
More questions?
Yeah, there is another one. It's regarding socioeconomic data. And we've been talking a lot about the science and collecting the aquifer data, but socioeconomics is one of the considerations when you're setting your DFC. Should districts be doing more to develop socioeconomic data? Right now, they're really just, I think, primarily looking to what the TWDB has on that. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was glad. I know in the first round of planning, we didn't, I believe, even have the Water Development Board socioeconomic data. So I will say on that, while yes, in the last couple of rounds, we've relied heavily on it, districts already, those that have been in existence for at least 10 years, were already looking at that because the data wasn't there from Water Development Board. So yes, absolutely. I think the more for that particular criteria, also property rights as well, the more that you can say, hey, we've looked at Water Development Board as a tool, we use them as a tool. We've used, for example, the North Central Texas, the planning agency that helps with local governments do their jobs. They do a lot of those kind of studies. And so partnering with them and it's essentially when you get two local governments that are doing, that have similar types of work and those can partner together, you use their data. And so yes, I think locally you need local data and then you also need Water Development Board's data as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see just a difference in the approaches for groundwater management across the state based on socioeconomic interest that are active in different areas. And I think you see that in rules. I think you see that in the approaches that districts use to manage. And I think there's just a lot of wisdom tied up in local management on that issue that can't be necessarily quantified in a way that we do it for the state water plan. And I think, again, Chapter 36 points to that local management to be, the driver for a lot of those big decisions.
I believe, let me double check. One last question that came in. What about DFCs? Could those be expressed as a volumetric cap?
What's the question again? I'm sorry.
Can DFCs be expressed as a volumetric cap? Is that something that's permissible?
Is that not been tried? And they kind of kicked that can when you had managed available groundwater? That was a cap?
Yeah.
Well,
Is that volumetric?
From the Water Development Board's perspective, it kind of, I guess I have a question as to what's really meant by a volumetric cap. If it's a production cap, that's a MAG. That's what modeled available groundwater is. So I think you'd cause some real internal conflict there in terms of the terms. But if the volumetric cap is X amount of volume to remain in storage over a certain amount of time, and that's an expression of a quantifiable condition
DFC.
in the aquifer, and it meets the very specific definition of how a DFC is defined in statute, perhaps. But if it speaks to production, I don't know. What do you all think?
I mean, from my perspective, the law was changed a few years ago or several years ago now to focus on actual production. So we went away from what's permitted, and now we're focused on actual production. And that's what I mentioned earlier about making sure that the integrity of your production data is as good as it can be. And so I think that it's not, I think, for example, it's hard to say, okay, in year, current, this fiscal year or production year, potentially that we busted the cap. But that doesn't mean you're necessarily not on track. And I know James says it best, so I'm taking some of your advice and also Dirk's, that just because you've busted the MAG, so to speak, does not mean that you're not on track to meet that DFC. For example, in a drought year, I think there's a lot of places that would. So it can't be a cap on a year-to-year basis. I think you have to look kind of where you're on your curve over your 50-year planning cycle and say, okay, so in year 1, maybe we have exceeded the MAG number, but in years 10 through 15 we didn't, and so we're on track to meet it. So again, it's over the long term, and I don't think on an annual basis, because that's not what the statute, it says on an average annual basis over that planning cycle.
Yeah, I think Dirk hit it on the head. I mean, 10 years ago, we went through that discussion when we changed the language in Chapter 36 from managed available groundwater to modeled available groundwater. And the point is, we don't have perfect data, we don't have perfect models, we don't have perfect volumes that end up coming out of those models. And so, in a perfect world, you could get closer to saying, yes, there's a volume that we're shooting for, and that's a cap. We've done away with, MAG as a cap. And it is for regional water planning, obviously, and it's planned around there. But, for all the reasons Kristen mentioned and that Dirk deals with every day with regard to data uncertainty, changes from year to year on actual usage and all of those things, it makes it difficult.
Yeah, and just unless I want to make sure we understand the question correctly. I heard the question to ask, could a volumetric limit be used as a DFC expression? And that's where I think it gets really complicated, because the DFC expression is supposed to be the source of the the production number, the volumetric production number. So I think that would be a little difficult. But I will just say from the DFCs that we observe coming through the board, because we've got sort of a statewide perspective, there are examples of desired future conditions that express an aquifer condition that also are directly correlated to a production number. And some districts weight that information differently. If you feel good about your correlation, production to DFC, you can use that in your permitting decisions and how you might regulate production. If you don't have as much confidence in that correlation, you might look at some other things. But again, statute limits that MAG to being a factor in the permitting decisions and not necessarily the factor or a cap.
All right. That was great. We went through most of the questions. We are out of time. I think we could probably keep you guys up here for another hour and not run out of things to talk about when you're in a room of groundwater nerds. But thank you so much. Let's give this panel a round of applause.